Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shishi, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 6. If I'm getting the structure of the chapters here in the Rambam correctly, then what's about to happen is we're beginning a 5-day journey to discuss all the halachas related to kvarim, to graves. As we're going to see, grave in this context has a bit of a wider meaning. It basically means the hole in the ground or the structure underground or above ground in which a corpse is interred, whether for the time being or permanently. And there are many laws related to the kever. Some of them we actually already discussed in the earlier chapters in the context of which entities related to a corpse transmit impurity. And we did learn a couple of the unique laws that relate to a grave, which is that once you enclose a dead body in a grave, the entirety of the grave, if it's a kever sasum, if it's a sealed grave, transmits impurity. You touch it anywhere, you make a tent over it, you become impure. We also learned in that context about a goylel. A goylel means something which is designated as a cover for a grave, whether it's makeshift or whether it's a regular cover. You're just covering a hole in the ground with a slab of stone or something like that. So we're going to explore all the halachas related to graves. And the way I see it, the beginning of this chapter is sort of an introduction to this concept, because yesterday we talked about the idea of kelim, utensils, being able to contract impurity from a corpse. The Rambam is of the opinion that that idea spreads to most types of utensils, whether it's metal, whether it's not metal, wood, glass, bone, stuff like that. Even pottery has certain levels of impurity. However, there are certain types of kelim that are not susceptible to impurity. Now, there's going to be an entire set of laws later in this book called Hilchos kelim, discussing exactly that, which type of vessels can become impure, which ones can't, how they become. It's 28 chapters, so for 4 weeks we're going to be on that. Nevertheless, in the context of these laws, having just said that kelim can contract ritual impurity, and as we are about to enter the laws related to graves, that Rambam gives us in short, in very, very short, some of the basics that govern which utensils can become impure, which utensils cannot. That's going to directly lead into discussion of using these materials as a goylel, as a covering for a grave. And we're going to learn that even certain things that are usually not susceptible to impurity, when they become part of a grave, they do become impure. And that's going to lift us off into the full discussion about graves, all kinds of structures surrounding dead bodies. And that's where we're going for the next 5 days. But first, again, as I said, we're going to get a little bit of a crash course on halacha's perspective on utensils, on kelim. Says the Rambam halacha aleph, atzmois hadog v'oiroi, the bones of a fish and its skin. Ha'oise mehen kelim, if somebody makes a utensil out of anything fish-like, einon mekablin tuma klal. They're not susceptible to any sort of impurity. Lei midivrei Torah v'lei midivrei seifrim, not biblical nor rabbinic. And there's a very big mystical significance to this. The fish, Kabbalistically, are not really creatures with their own identity. Their main existence comes from the water around them. In fact, the Medrash says that Adam, when he named all the creatures, he never gave names to the fish, which serves to demonstrate exactly that point. What's a name? When you get a name, you establish your identity as separate from everybody else. The fish have no name. Their identity is fused with the water, with the source of their life. As the famous story of Rabbi Akiva, when he was asked why he taught Torah even when the Romans were decreeing death for it, because like fish in the water, you can't leave the water, you can't leave your source of life, otherwise you would die. Fish know that. Fish have it in their consciousness. We don't. Sometimes we also have our source of life. We have our water and we think we can jump out of it. And the lesson for us is, if we would recognize the fact that we have to always be in our source, we would also not be susceptible to impurity. What's impurity? When does the negative force take over a Jew? When the Jew's not in touch with his real self, when he thinks he's outside of his water. But when you're in the water, nothing can get to you. Fish have no impurity. V'chein so too yeroika shal pnei hamayim, the green stuff that grows on the face of the water. It has many names. Some people call it moss, algae, water silk. The fancy name for it is spirogyra, if you want to know. This green stuff that collects, the Rambam describes it elsewhere, it also collects on the sides of boats when they sit in the water for a long time. So this material, v'chayetze ba, or anything like it, if you form anything out of it, it is not susceptible to impurity. Shekol masha bayam toher k'meishi yizbar b'ilchis kelim. For as will be explained in the laws about vessels, anything that's in the sea is pure. Lefikach, therefore, ha'oise oihel me'oir hadog. If somebody were to construct a tent out of fish skin, or from this water silk that grows on the sea, the actual tent itself will not become impure. Even though it can spread the impurity to anything that's under it, like any other tent, but the tent itself will not become impure. As we saw yesterday at the end of the chapter, that typically when a tent is made of somewhat non-permanent material, it does itself contract impurity. Not in this case. If it comes from a fish or it comes from the algae, no impurity. Halacha beis, another type of utensil which does not contract impurity, clay glolim, things that are formed from animal dung. You wouldn't believe it. People used to do that. They used to mix animal dung with water, and it would form these hardened utensils that you could actually use in daily life. So much so there was a culture where it was part of the rite of passage or some kind of element of marriage, where young girls would take this animal dung, mix it with water, and make some kind of a utensil that would serve as part of their decorative stuff related to the wedding. Look it up online. It's fascinating stuff. It's called the dung bowl. Anyway, if you make a utensil out of hardened animal dung, uklei avanim, or a utensil out of stone, uklei adama, or a utensil out of earth. Earth is not to be confused with cheres. Cheres is earthenware. It also comes from clay. But where cheres is fired in a kiln and hardened through fire, the adama kelim are either hardened through the sun or they're just left in their natural state, somewhat soft, pliable clay. The point is they're earth utensils, clay utensils. Einan mekablin tuma, these do not receive, they cannot contract any impurity at all, not biblically nor rabbinically, bein tumas meis, bein shara tumas, whether the impurity of a corpse or any other form of impurity. Another very important category of vessels that does not contract impurity. V'chein, so too says the Rambam, kli eitz ha'osui lenachas, literally translated as a wooden utensil which is meant to just be there, to sit there. It's not meant to move. Kegoin, for example, hateva, a chest, v'hamigdal, and a cabinet. Some say it's the opposite. One's a cabinet, one's a chest. V'hakaveres, and a beehive-like shaped utensil. As we're going to see, this is going to come up many times in these laws. This was apparently a very used type of utensil. It was round and had a flat bottom, stood upright, and it was very big. It was used as some kind of storage container. Shehin machzikin arbaim sa'a belach. If any of these three things, or things like it, can hold 40 sa'a of liquid measurement, it's about as big as a mikveh, very big. V'yiyah lahem shulayim, and they have a bottom. Einan mekablin tuma klal, they don't contract impurity at all. Le'mei divrei Torah, le'mei divrei seifrim, not biblically nor rabbinically. Ve'elu hina nikrayin, these are also called, they have a second name, kli eitz haba bamida, wooden utensils that come in oversize. Big size wooden utensils. That's the two names. Kli eitz ha'asur lenachas, kli eitz haba bamida, both a reference to a big wooden container that can hold 40 sa'ah of liquid or more. Halacha gimel, kli eitz in general. Something to know about wooden utensils, pshuteim tahirim. If they're flat, they have no receptacle, no rim on the sides, they are pure, totally unsusceptible to impurity. This board is not so accurate, it has a little indent there. Ignore the indent, imagine it was fully flat. Fully flat is tahir. Umekableim tumeim, once you have a receptacle, some kind of receptacle of a wooden utensil, it becomes susceptible to impurity. Klei cheres, same for pottery utensils, pshuteyan tahirin, flat pieces that have no receptacle are pure, umekableyan tmeyin, whereas receptacles can become impure. The ein tmeyin, as we said though, pottery utensils have the special law, they can only become impure, either by having something enter their airspace, or by a zav moving them. Here is the mouse entering the airspace of the utensil, that's when it becomes impure, or if you have a pottery utensil on one side of a seesaw, and a zav, somebody who has an irregular discharge, someone like that, a person who himself is a primary source of impurity, moves them by virtue of his weight or whatever way you do hesed, that will make the pottery utensil impure. Even if the utensil, the pottery utensil, actually touched a corpse, but it was from its outside, it doesn't become impure. But once some element of impurity comes into its airspace, even though it didn't touch the walls of the utensil, nitma, the utensil becomes impure. It's a very special law with relation to pottery. Another special law for pottery utensils. If a pottery utensil was with the dead body in a tent, nitma, it becomes impure. That's a variation of the impurity entering its inside. Once you're in a tent with a corpse, there's an energy of impurity all around. So the impurity in the airspace is considered to have entered the airspace of the utensil. But if it was surrounded with what's called a tzamid pasil, that means a tight covering, it and anything in it is pure, as is explicit in the Torah, a very special law which we're going to expound upon in chapters 21, 22, 23 of this set of laws. Torah says, "V'chol kli fasuach," any open utensil, asher ein tzamid pasil alav, which has no tight covering on it, tamehu, is impure. This implies that if there's a tight covering on a utensil, it can save everything in it. The utensil and everything in it remains pure. She'ein tuma nichnes alei ela mipischai ubeheset hazav, because the only way to get impurity into a pottery utensil, we repeat, is by having something come into its airspace or having a zav move it, sh'hareu kimisha naga bekule, because when a zav moves it, it's as if you touched everything, including the inside airspace. Now, having taken this crash course of which utensils are susceptible and which are not, let's take that and translate it to what would happen with regards to a grave. Halacha daled oiseh goylel midavar she'einu mekabel tuma. A person makes a covering for a grave, that's the word goylel, how we're going to translate it. A person makes a covering for a grave out of something which is not susceptible to impurity. Let's say he places a slab of stone over the grave, a kli adama, or an earth utensil, a kli eitz haba b'mida, or a massive wooden utensil, a kli cheres hamukaf tzamid pasil, or the pottery utensil surrounded with a tight covering, a oir hadag va'atzmei v'chayetze ba'elu, or the skin of a fish, or its bone, anything like that. Even though these elements in and of themselves are not susceptible to impurity, now that you've turned them into an accessory to a grave, if you touch them, you're so impure for 7 days. On account of the fact that you've touched a covering for a grave. The moment you take them off, and they're no longer serving as the accessory, the cover, or you took away the dead body. So even though it's a covering over a hole, which is for a grave, but there's no dead body there anymore, they revert back to their natural state of being pure. So too, an animal which you tied down and made it into a covering for a grave, typically animals cannot become impure. That was in chapter 1, right? The only living being which becomes impure is a human being. Animal by itself can never become impure. Now you tied it down, you made it into a covering for a grave. Anybody that touches it while it's serving as a covering will become impure for 7 days. By the way, should have pointed it out before, the stone or the animal itself always remains pure. They always retain their inherent property of not being susceptible to impurity. But as far as serving as a conductor of the impurity of the grave, yes, once you put them down as the cover, anybody that touches them becomes impure. Hitera behema, once you untie the animal, even if you left it in place, you just untied it as the commentaries explained. Once it's untied, it's free. It's not serving as a cover anymore. It's now back to being pure like any other animal. And if you touch it, nothing happens. Same thing if you have a barrel full of liquid, mukefes tzamid pasil, covered by a tight covering. Now it cannot contract impurity. And you made it into a covering for a grave for a dead body. If you touch it, you're going to be impure for 7 days. But the barrel itself and the liquids themselves are pure because that's their inherent property, not to become impure. You have a log that you made into a covering for a grave. Now we're going to first go with the opinion of the Kesef Mishnah on this law. Bein oimedas, bein muta al tzida. We're talking about whether it's standing or lying on its side. So, the way the Kesef Mishnah explains this is, standing means it's a short and a wide log. It's covering only part of the hole of the grave. It goes across the entire width, and it's also sticking out. Muta al tzida means lying on its side, a longer log, lying horizontally, across the length of the grave, and sticking out on either side. And the novelty of the halacha here is, ein tameh ela keneged pesach hakever bilvat. Even though the entirety of the log, seemingly, is serving as the covering of the grave, the only part that actually transmits impurity is the part that's directly above the grave, above the opening of the grave. And if somebody were to touch the edge that's sticking out of the grave, in the first case, out of the width, and in the second case, past the length, tahor, you would be pure. The Ma'ari Kurkus has the same understanding of the halacha. He just explains the word oimedes and mutal tzida as both referring to a long log, actually shaped down, we'll call it a 2x4, Oimedes means it's standing on its narrow side. Mutal tzida means it's lying on its wider side. And the point is the same, it's lying horizontally across the grave. Only if you touch the part that's above the grave directly will you become impure, otherwise you're pure. Asa roisha, goylel lekever, if you made only the edge of a long log, that's how we're going to explain it, a covering for a grave, so let's look at it over here. It's a long log, the head of the log is serving as a covering for the grave. It's not sticking out. That isn't the novelty here. We've already discussed that. If it's sticking out, the parts that are sticking out are not transmitting impurity. Here we're talking about the height. You stand up a log over a grave as a covering, not the whole log becomes considered a cover. It's standing on top of the grave like a tree. Only the first 4 handbreadths transmit impurity. Anybody who touches it within the 4 handbreadths close to the grave, tamei mishum goylel, will become impure on account of touching a covering of a grave. From 4 and above, he will become pure. Says the Rambam, when do we say that? There's a difference between 4 and the rest. If you're actually planning to chop it down. But if you aren't planning to chop it down, kula goylel, then in fact, for whatever reason, that's your choice, but the entire log becomes a goylel, and you touch any part of the log, you will become impure. The commentaries note that the Rambam, when describing this tall log, only talks about noigeya, touching. Because if you formed an oihel over it, if you were to stand above the log, even though you're forming the oil above the higher part of the log, since you're also forming an oil over the lower part of the log automatically, so you will become impure anyway. As far as why in the first case, when it was sticking out, why did the Rambam only use the word negeya? Because the oil is obvious. You make a tent over a part that's sticking out of the grave, that's obvious you're not going to become impure. The chidush is that even if you touch it, and touching means you're touching the same unit, it's the same thing that's covering the grave or not, still, if it's sticking out of the grave, you're pure. Halacha vav, shtei avonim gedolos, shel arba tfachim sha'asan goylel. You have 2 massive stones, each one has dimensions of 4 by 4 handbreadths. And you made them into a goylel, into a covering of the grave. Together, hamahil al gabe shteyen tameh, one who becomes a tent over, literally it means over both of them, but the Kesef Mishnah explains over any one of them. If you become an oil over any one of them, you've made an oil over a goylel, you are impure. Nitla achas mihan, however, if you take one of them away, even though the one that remains is a goylel, still a covering for the grave, hamahil al gabe shniya tar. If you were to form a tent over this second stone, you'd actually be pure. Because the impurity has a way to escape. It's not going to escape to the stone and become caught in the stone, and therefore if you cover the stone, you're covering impurity. No, the impurity will go out through the open airspace, and making a tent over the stone, even though it's over the grave, will not make you impure. Now the way I just said that is the way some commentators understand it. The way the Kesef Mishnah understands it, he says, no, if you made an oihel over the stone while it's actually over the grave, you're going to become impure. The chidush of this halacha is, if you made an oihel over the part of the stone that's not covering the grave, or that's covering the wall of the grave. That's where the chidush is, that because the tumah has a way to escape, you're not going to become impure. Halacha zayin gal shel tzreiros sha'asa'ohu geila lekever. You have a pile of little stones that you made into a massive covering over the grave. Ein tameh ela seder hapnimi. The only parts of this girdle which will transmit impurity is the innermost row, shehu tzarkei shel kever, which serves the actual needs of the grave, creating the basic covering. Aval hanegeya b'sha'ru avonim tar. But if you touch any of the other stones that are not directly serving as a cover, you're actually pure. Now again, the Rambam uses the word negeya because it's only when touching that there's a difference between the lower and higher rows. If you're making an oil over the whole thing, then by default you've made an oil over the lower stones, and therefore you're impure anyway. Halacha ches, we begin to deal with cases of graves dug into stone. And we begin with the following scenario. Ardain shehu chakuk b'sela. A grave that's dug or carved into stone. I know it looks green, don't think about it as grass, this is stone. A stone area. And you dug a grave into the stone, you put v'hinichu by Meis, you put in the dead body from on top. That's how the Kesef Mishnah explains it. V'kisuhu b'goylel, and you covered it with a goylel. Let's just call it a slab of stone for practical purposes. Says the Rambam, and it seems obvious, but you have to say it. Hanegea basela b'chol makom tahor. If you touch any of the stone, the bedrock itself, anywhere around the grave, you are pure. Whereas if you touch the actual slab of stone, which is the foreign cover from the grave, that is going to make you impure. But the walls of the grave, since they're bedrock, what's called karka olam, they do not transmit impurity. And it's quite obvious, because then every person that's buried ever in the ground makes the entire world impure, because the entire world is serving as a grave, so to speak, a wall of the grave to the dead body. So obviously what's in the bedrock is not going to impart impurity. Or lemazeh doime, what is this similar to? Leber gadol mali mesim, you have a massive pit full of a bunch of dead bodies. Ve'evan gedela al pia, with a large stone covering it. She'ein tami ala keneged chalala. The only area which is impure is the part that's opposite the cavity of the grave. However, ve'im bana nefesh al gaba, if you build a mausoleum on top of it to encapsulate the entire burial chamber that you chose to make in this stone, harezu kekever sasum, this entire mausoleum becomes like what's called a sealed grave, umitame mikol sviva, and it transmits impurity to everything around it. You touch any part of the mausoleum, you are impure. Now that Rambam moves on to another case, and we're going to explain it first like the Mari Kurkus does, based on the Rambam himself in Pirush HaMishnayos, when explaining the Mishnah, which is the source of this law. Hoysa ha'oren ha'chakuka b'sela. We're dealing with the same scenario. It's a grave dug into stone. However, one major difference. This is talking about a stone that's jutting out of the mountain. So before we were talking about a mountain, you dug this grave into the mountain. Here, in these scenarios, we're going to be referring to a little element of stone that's sticking out of the rest of the mountain. So the first case deals with when the rock in which the grave is dug is shaped rechava milamata v'tzara milamayla. It's wider on the bottom, narrower on the top. And you also dug the grave in that way, in the trapezoid shape, wider on the bottom, narrower on the top. The Meis b'seicha, and the dead body is inside of it. Says the Rambam, Hanegea ba milamaton tohir umilamaylon tameh. One who touches this grave of sorts from the bottom is pure, from the top is impure. What is bottom and top? So the Rambam explains in Pirush HaMishnayos that the bottom means the bedrock, the natural rock that's under where the dead body is. So right over here, this part, even though it's part of the grave, so to speak, but it's still considered part of the bedrock and does not transmit impurity. Once you hit the area which begins to be opposite the dead body, since it's shaped in this going inwards, this getting narrower shape, so all of this, both sides can be considered to be a goylo, a cover to the grave. And therefore, you're touching a goylo, you're touching the covering, you become impure. The upper sides are becoming a covering over the dead body. And they become like a goylo, a covering. What if it's the flip side? Again, stone is jutting out of the mountain, but it's jutting out in a way where it gets wider on the top. It's narrower on bottom, wider on the top. You dug in a little grave in the same shape, the upside down trapezoid, narrower on the bottom, wider on the top. Says the Rambam, wherever you touch it, you're going to be impure. Even if you touch the outer side of the bottom part of the rock. Why? Because even this part is under the goylo. It's under the part that you're covering the grave with. And therefore, the impurity extends all the way down. And even if you touch this side or you touch this side, you're going to become impure. Hoysa shava, if it was equal. It didn't go this way, it didn't go that way. The part of the stone jutting out of the mountain was beautifully rising up perpendicular to the mountain. Hanegeaba, so now what happens? Says the Rambam, Hanegeaba mitefach hasamuch lekarka isa. Ulemaila, we divide the part under the dead body in two. The first tefach, the first handbreadth, and up, including the walls, are all considered serving the grave, tameh. They're all impure. Mitefach ulemata tahir. After one tefach, the grave doesn't require it anymore, so to speak. It considers part of the bedrock, karka oilam, and therefore you're pure. Now, as I mentioned, this is the way the Mari Kurkus explains it, based on the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos. Kesef Mishnah understands that the scenario was not where the opening was on top, rather where the opening was on the side. Same idea, stone is jutting out, but here, in all the cases, the top layer of the grave was natural stone. You dug into the stone on the side, and you put the corpse in on the side. So when it's narrower on top and wider on bottom, same thing, bottom part is tar, top part is tameh. When it's the other way, it's all tameh, and when it's this way, exactly equal. So till one tefach, it's tameh. After one tefach downwards, it's tar. Nikav arein besela. You made a hole into the mountain. This is different than the last case. The last case is you dug a proper grave into the mountain. Here, you simply dug a hole straight in to the stone. V'hichnis hameis b'seicha k'maynagar, or k'mayneger. And you stuck the corpse inside of it like a crossbar. Crossbar were those bars that used to rest across the doors as a lock from the inside. Same thing, you're sticking the mace right in. So everything in the mountain is considered to be bedrock, natural, doesn't serve the grave. There's no cover over here of any sort. And therefore, if you touch any part of it, you're pure, except for the place of the opening. The place of the opening is where the impurity emerges, and therefore you're going to be impure if you touch that. Halacha tes. You have the cave, which has the graves inside it, and a courtyard in front of the cave. We'll see more about this in later days, but typically the way they used to bury in the times of the Mishnah was in a catacomb underground. Maybe this picture is not so accurate because it has the sky as if it's on top of the ground. But you used to go down into a little cave, they would dig in to this cave, and they'd make crypts, a whole bunch of recesses in the wall in which they would bury corpses. Every room where you went into and it had a bunch of graves, that's called the ma'ara, the cave with the graves. In front of the ma'ara, there was always a chatzer, a little open area. Sometimes there were multiple caves. Here I just have one. You go into this door, you have the graves. But maybe over here also there could be more graves. Over here also there could be more graves. Here we're talking about just one cave with a chatzer in front of it. Bizman sheh chatzer la'avir, says the Rambam, when the courtyard is open air, it's unroofed, ha'aymed l'seicha tahar, just standing in this courtyard is not going to make you impure. You're actually pure. As long as you don't get too close to the lintel of the opening to the cave. Point is, the cave and the chatzar are two distinct entities. But if the courtyard is roofed, there's a roof over this. Now, had the roof gone all the way to the edge of the cave, the tumah would depart from the cave and it would spread to the entire courtyard because of the roof. Therefore, says the Rambam, if there's a roof on the chatzar, if there was some open space near the cave, at least a square area, 4x4 tvachim or more, if you go into the courtyard, you are going to be pure. The tumah has no space to spread from the cave into the courtyard. But if the area where it's open is less than 4x4 tvachim, anybody that goes in there is impure, even though you did not touch the opening of the cave, because the fact that it's less than 4 tvachim of unroofed makes the roof extend all the way to the cave. The tumah departs from the cave into the chatzar, and therefore anybody that's in the chatzar becomes impure. All this reflects the Rambam's interpretation of the Mishnah in Maseches Oles. The Rabbi over here points out that the Rambam is a very unique approach. The classic approach is that the two courtyards are not, whether it's open air or not open air, but whether it's open to the outside or it's surrounded by catacombs on all sides. See the Ravid for further elaboration on a different take on what this case would mean.